I actually saw the Matrix Revolutions. No, Resurrections. There's been so many, sometimes they just kind of merge together. But I actually did see the movie last night, and I pre recorded everything that I wanted to say in a review in audio format. And I'm realizing that's way too much effort because they really didn't put much effort in this film, at least in my humble opinion. So instead of actually using the audio form and getting clips and putting all that in there, I am just going to say what is good, what is bad, and what is ugly about the Matrix Resurrections. Try to do it at least in maybe certain categories. I don't know. Like, talk about the good, talk about the bad, talk about the ugly, all that stuff. But anyway, I am not going to put that much effort into this film because they didn't do it here. So without further ado, this is the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Matrix Resurrections. Oh boy. There is not much good to actually say about this film, but there is good to say nonetheless. It was nice to actually see Neo again, Trinity, and even Nairobi, as old as she was. It was nice to actually see them again and see them reprise their roles as those characters. Keanu Reeves, Carrie Ann Moss, and even Jada Pinkett Smith. Even though I don't care much for her, but anyway, she is a good actress. But I will say this. Some of the philosophies that they had in there actually was interesting to think about, especially when it comes to choices. The illusion of choice and just making choices in general. That whole premise, that whole philosophical premise is interesting. I kind of dove a little bit into it when I recorded it, but the fact that I can barely remember it now kind of shows how very little I care about philosophy. But when I did see it, it kind of makes you think. That was pretty much the overall premise of The Matrix. It kind of made you think about certain aspects of life in general. So, yeah. And even though I can't really name the whole philosophical points because, oh, screw it. Who am I kidding? I hate philosophy. That's not a good part. Let's go into the bad. That's the only thing I can pretty much say. It's great to actually see the characters that came into this film again, but let's just get into the bad. I can't say anything good about this thing. I'm going to be honest. I can't. Now, when it comes to nostalgia baiting, can I honestly say that this movie was nostalgia baiting? Not entirely. It was kind of half. It was more focused on the Matrix and Matrix Revolutions, as well as Matrix Resurrections. And yeah, they brought out the Frenchman. I don't even remember who he is. But I just know that him being a Reloaded was just weird. But to be honest, it was just completely unnecessary. The fact that they rely heavily on the Matrix itself and the story and how everything went, it could have been better. This movie had the potential to actually be its own story. They didn't have to use Agent Smith. And by the way, yeah, it's going to be major spoilers here. I should have said this at first. But they didn't have to use Agent Smith in a different form. They didn't have to use Morpheus in a different form. They could have used different characters and made it a movie that kind of paid homage to the Matrix. They didn't even have to use Neo or Trinity or especially Nairobi, because Nairobi was pretty much an insignificant character, not only in the sequel, but also in the final movie. She didn't even need to be there. But the only ones that everybody cares about is Morpheus, Trinity, and Neo. If you had them on there, at least explain what they did in the past to, I guess, inspire the future. It would have made more sense for them to do it that way than bring these characters that are pretty much in their 50s to do kung fu or movie kung fu where they're stiff, they're wooden, they can't even do what they used to do anymore, and it's a given. You didn't really need to do that. And not only that, we all know that Hugo Weaving and Lawrence Fishburne immortalized their characters as Morpheus and Agent Smith. It doesn't make any sense to even have those characters even in there without the original. I'm just saying, it doesn't. Was there a story to this? In my opinion, there really wasn't. And it just seems like they really didn't care much for the franchise itself. And that's just what I got from the Wachowskis. They probably didn't want to make another one regardless. And it showed in this film. There was barely a story here. Even when it came to Discount Morpheus, it seemed like he rarely cared to be involved at all. The only one that was bright-eyed and absolutely sucked everything in was pretty much Bugs. And Bugs was an interesting character, but I think she was supposed to be kind of a discount version of Trinity. And I'm just like, what is the purpose of all this? And then you have Sig, that is pretty much, or Sieg or Seek, whatever, the tech guy that's pretty much supposed to be like Tank. But I'm not sure whether or not he's actually a descendant from Tank or a descendant from the dude that was actually in Revolutions. Not Revolutions. Reloaded. I can't remember his character's name, but I know it's not Tank. The guy who played Tank wasn't there. But I think he was probably a descendant from one of them. And yeah, we know the ship was a discount Nebuchadnezzar. This is pretty much like a retold or rehashing of a story that we already know. And the fact is, it just really didn't have any relevance whatsoever. Did you care about the characters if they were in peril? No. Did you care about what could have happened? No. There were absolutely no stakes in this film whatsoever. The only thing I can say about the original, as well as the entire trilogy as a whole, you felt like there were stakes, major stakes, that both sides were fighting for. You rooted for people you barely knew. You even rooted for the tertiary characters because they had something to fight for, and they would lose everything if they lost. And you knew that. You felt that going in throughout the entire trilogy. Even though Reloaded was weird, and yes, it was weird, you still kind of rooted for everything to go the way it should go. You still rooted for them to succeed. You cared about every character there. But The Matrix was the one that kind of hit it home the most. I barely saw Switch. Switch was there like, she only had maybe a few lines, but I still cared about her when she got unplugged. And for those that haven't seen The Matrix, sorry. I mean, I can't really say spoilers because it's a 20-year-old movie. But anyway, when it came to the characters that were there briefly, you honestly cared about them when they got unplugged. And they were a little bit more detailed about how things went. This was incredibly loose. When it came to being unplugged in the real world, unless you were detached from the internet or wherever you were if you were detached from the Matrix and they were able to unplug you, you would still survive. But if your consciousness died inside the Matrix, your body would die on the outside. And they kind of made that plain to you. You didn't really have to explain much watching The Matrix because they explained it to you and it made sense without it feeling like you're being overwhelmed with material or information. But in this case, they explained very little about what was going on. A lot of things changed. And even though The Matrix had to be, rebooted, it had to be different from the last, it should have still had the same rules. But it seemed like a lot of stuff has changed. And the whole power of love thing. Well, seriously, Trinity died. She was impaled in the Machine City. So how can the power of love be relevant here? And not to mention, in The Matrix Reloaded, Neo was able to use his powers outside the Matrix. And it would have been nice to explain how that happened. But did they? No, because I think the Wachowskis pretty much forgot everything they wrote in the past 20 years. And it showed here. But this story made zero sense. There was no stakes at all, and you didn't even care if the character's liver died. And Nairobi was just mad because of the possibility of, a potential war, even though they had a very synergistic relationship with, I guess, Cynthius, I guess they're kind of... Maybe they're people that maybe they're like the machines that defected from the old machine ways. Instead of harvesting people, they actually work with them. And seeing how you actually do have somewhat of a relationship with these machines that actually do help you grow food as well as adapt in a different life, why are you still underground? Can anybody explain to me why these people are still living in a cave when they should have been on the surface a long time ago? If 60 years have passed, that means the atmosphere has changed, which means there is a possibility with less machine cities that they can still go on the surface without dying. So why are they still in a cave? The story was awful. It was poorly written. It made no sense whatsoever. And people are like, well, The Matrix didn't make any sense. Actually, it made more sense than this movie here. Oh, and yeah, there is an ugly. And it wasn't ugly in 1999. It actually was revolutionary. It changed the game. It revolutionized how Hollywood saw action movies to where it was constantly used in every film there was, parodied right and left in every comedic movie you can think of. And it was also used a lot in Max Payne. So now, 23 years later, when it's introduced again, it's not so exciting. And yeah, I mean bullet time. The bullet time part, the slow-mo, everything was just ugly. It didn't work. It wasn't impressive because you see it everywhere now. It was impressive in 1999 because that's the first time we've ever seen it. And that was the first time they've ever used camera work like that. But 23 years later, when you see movies that are doing a lot more with CG, doing a lot more with 3D graphics, doing a lot more with different kinds of techniques, especially using practical effects and mixing CG, this is not impressive. It's just not. It looks ugly. It looks out of date. It looks unwarranted. It looks unneeded. It just looks bad. So yeah, the bullet time part is the ugliest part of this entire movie. I never thought I would say that, but it was. Overall, this movie really wasn't that good at all, but it had potential to be good, but it just wasn't there yet. And my overall score for this thing is definitely 2 out of 5 stars. It could have been better. It had a potential to be its own standalone, but instead of doing something different and being a little original with, their main Matrix world, especially the fact that Matrix can actually recreate itself and be different every time it reboots, they use an old reference, an out-of-date reference that isn't relevant to today. To be honest with you, it was 20 years old, 20 years ago since this thing came out, since the first Matrix in 1999. You kind of want to spice things up. Not just so much spice it up, but just make it to where that it's still the Matrix, but its own original idea. They did that in the games. How come they couldn't do it here? It's disappointing how this movie could have been better, but it also shows how much the Wachowskis hate the franchise because you show they didn't really put much love in it. Well, guys, that was a good, the bad, and the ugly of The Matrix Resurrections, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think. How would you rate this movie out of 5 stars? What did you think of the movie when you watched it? Leave your comments below. Let me know how you feel, and I'll talk to y'all later. Peace out.